welcome, Andreas. Thank you for accepting our invitation. For those who are joining us to listen to this vodcast, Andreas Schleicher is the Director of Education and Skills at the OECD, and he is also the originator of the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competences, the well-known Program for International Student Assessment, and other international measurements. And I'd like to welcome you.
Thanks so much for hosting me, Janet.
Thanks. So today we are focused on adult competences and particularly transversal skills and competences. And I'll have to note that there is no one definition of what transversal skills and competences are. So I'd like to ask you, Andreas, how the OECD defines those transversal competences.
Yeah, we typically distinguish between job-specific knowledge and skills, things that you can apply in one specific area, and transversal skills that you can apply in multiple areas, that you can transfer from one context to another context. So literacy, numeracy are obvious examples for that. But there's no sharp dividing line, I think. But it's helpful, I think, to think in terms of the generality of the skills that we have.
Right. So there's also an element of social emotional competences that are important in different settings.
Yeah, I would say transversal skills do include a whole range of cognitive, social, and emotional skills. I think at the workplace, can you work with people who are different from you? Can you think for yourself? All of those things are important and are part of the mix that make people successful at the workplace. That, by the way, is also the reason why in the latest round of PIAAC, or the survey of adult skills, we did include a range of social and emotional aspects.
So can you tell us a little bit about how you're measuring those? Because that's not really necessarily self-evident.
Yeah, actually, you could argue it's not self-evident how we measure numeracy and mathematical skills. It's just that when we look at different dimensions of skills, we have to adapt our measurement technologies. Now, if we think about measurement as tests, then social emotional skills are hard to capture. But if we take a more open view on measurement, we can actually capture a whole range of social emotional skills. I give you an example from the other end of the spectrum, from small children. Someone once asked me when I talked about, social emotional skills among kindergarten children, show me that you can measure empathy for a 5-year-old child and then we can talk. And actually we did that. We just gave them a story on a tablet where they had to, look at different characters, and we could see their reactions, their responses, and it actually turned out to be quite reliable measure, but it was not a test. It was just a different way of capturing information. Some of the information we look at through self-reported skills. That is perhaps not as objective, but often a quite valid way of capturing people's behavior. These days, actually, process data are quite powerful. Your mobile phone knows probably a lot more about your social emotional skills than you imagine yourself. And we just need to become better to harvest those kinds of data and translate them into meaningful metrics.
So it might be useful actually for people who are not as familiar with PIAAC to describe how the tests are administered.
Yeah, PIAAC is a household survey. So we go to people's homes and we administer computer-based tests to them and also ask them a lot of background questions. That is very challenging in itself. Logistically, you have to take a representative sample of adults, and then you have to get to their homes, and that's where the difficulties actually start. Convincing someone, particularly people who may not have so high levels of skills, who may not have been so successful in school, to convince them actually that they can make a good contribution to the world by revealing what they're good at, where they struggle with. It is very, very challenging, but we did succeed in the first round of PIAAC, and we are now conducting a second wave. And so once people agree to this, we give them a computer-based tests where they look at problem-solving tasks, literacy-related tasks, numeracy-related tasks, and a range of questions around social-emotional skills. And then those questions are recorded, and later on they are scored and scaled so that we can compare them within and across countries and also across social groups. And the minimum sample is about 5,000 adults, so it's quite a large group of people taken through, representing the entire population. So that's basically the methodology behind it.
That's internationally or within each country?
Within each country. And sometimes when countries, look at this for different regions, they'll have to boost the sample correspondingly. It's a very resource-intensive effort, but actually it's our only way of understanding something about the skills of adults. Because you might think, oh, well, people got degrees and qualifications, but, they represent the long gone past of what you did once in your lifetime. We forget things, we lose skills that we do not use. So try to, answer a test that in mathematics that you could do at age 15, and actually it might be quite difficult. And we gain a lot of skills through, not formal education often, but the way of working and so on. And so taking a real snapshot is our only way to assess not what people qualified once in their life, but what they actually know and can do. And so it is really, really important. It's the world's only metric, really, to capture skills.
And this is, how many cycles of PIAAC have there been so far?
We're now in the second one. We have
second cycle.
Well, it depends what you call cycle. We've administered the first wave in different kind of contexts, but we had basically one PIAAC assessment, and now we have a second one going through several iterations. And we can't administer it in all countries at the same time. Some countries need more time and so on, but it is basically the second big implementation 10 years after we did the first one.
Okay, great. And then, of course, lots of things have happened in those 10 years, so it'll be quite interesting to see. So the results for that will be published in 2024 or 2025?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's too early to ask you this. Have there been any trends from between the first cycle and the data that you're gathering now in the last 10 years that you could pinpoint?
Yeah, we will only, have data by the end of 24, really, for the second survey cycle. But what's obvious that the context of, literacy and numeracy has changed. Digitalization, has posed, literacy is a very different concept 10 years later. 10 years ago, most of the material that you read was still on, paper. It was still predefined. When you didn't know the answer to a question, you could look it up in an encyclopedia, you could trust the answer, you find it to be true. That context has radically changed. You look at ChatGPT, you look at, Google, you ask a question, you get 100,000 answers, and nobody is going to tell you what's right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. Literacy is now about constructing knowledge, a very different kind of skill set. So in a way, you can say the demands on people have massively changed, and the extent to which people are living up to that, we're going to know in a year's time.
I wanted to ask you how you work with employers and other consultants to design the PIAAC tool and decide what's the most important to measure.
Yeah, very good question. Actually, that's what takes longest in the survey of adult skills. Like the administration is, a formal process, but actually we spend about 4 or 5 years to think through with the users of skills. Now, what aspects of literacy, numeracy, problem solving, social emotional skills are relevant in what context, in what culture, and then to operationalize those, to build, metrics, questionnaires, surveys around that. It is a very, very complex and lengthy process to understand, to anticipate also the evolution of skill demand. The survey is done every 10 years, so the data that we have needs to sort of live for another decade. And so we need to actually not just be good at asking today's employers what you need now, but actually to anticipate the evolution of labor demand, to anticipate, what technology might do to this. And so we don't know to what extent we'll do that, get that right, but I think we put a lot of effort into understanding this and then designing the instruments.
Right. lifelong learning approach at OECD. Can you talk a little bit about how you address people's needs in daily life?
Yeah, that's one of the most important aspects for us here, that in the past, you used to learn to do the work, and now learning is the work. Basically, our continuous, ability, our willingness to, learn, to unlearn, to relearn when the context changes. Now, that's almost more defining than the skill set with which you get into work. Can you actually, do you see, your horizon? Do you see the kind of maybe skills gaps that you have? Do you put the time and effort into this? As humans, we always value the present over the future. And it's actually in school, you have a captive audience. You can, educate people. But once people get out of formal education, it takes a lot to motivate people to learn. It takes also strong policies, making learning granular, giving people signals that are small enough that actually smaller investments in learning will pay off in some ways, and micro-credentials, tools like this. And so I think public policy is very, very important.
Great. So I'd like to ask you, because we've been talking a lot about the macro level, and of course, for Transval, the audience we're trying to reach is the on-the-ground practitioners in guidance and validation for adult learners. Do you have some specific thoughts that you'd like to share in terms of what countries need to think about? Because the landscape is so heterogeneous across countries, and the guidance and validation practitioners are not always professionalized. What would you advise countries to think about in terms of helping this sector further develop?
Well,
what do you see as needs for further research in the area of adult transversal skills and competences?
I think we need a lot of research on measuring harder to measure skills. If you think about creativity, if you think about, some of the social emotional skills, things that we know are incredibly important are very, very hard to measure. I think that's where research is needed. We need a better understanding of the factors that impact those knowledge and skills and attitudes. Cross-sectional data only get you that far. We need to complement those kinds of data with other types of research that give us a better understanding of the causal nature of some of those relationships. So I think there is a wealth of research that is really important. In a way, there is a huge imbalance between what we know about learning early in life and the little we really know about how adults develop their skills or not, and what use that has for them and the economies.
Right. Okay, great. Then let me thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and everything that you've been learning through PIAAC and your other research.
Well, thanks again for hosting me, Janet.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Hello, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today talking to you about validation of non-formal and informal learning, Janet. So my name is Manuel Souto-Otero, and I am a professor of education at Cardiff University in Wales, in the UK. And I have been involved in the area of validation for almost the best part of 2 decades now, involved in the project on European inventory on validation of non-formal and informal learning for Cedefop and the European Commission, and working with Ernesto, having the pleasure to work with Ernesto on that project, but also it's part of my academic research. So it's around how skills are recognized, how they are identified, how they are communicated, and what consequences does that have for individuals within the education system, and also when they are in the labor market.
Thank you for having me. And as Manuel said, I work for Cedefop, as the European Center for the Development of Vocational Training in Thessaloniki. Greece is a decentralized agency of the European Commission. So we basically support the Commission in developing European policies. We do studies and research on specific areas, especially on vocational education and training. And I am working mainly on validation of non-formal and informal learning. As Manuel said, I have been involved in the European Inventory of Validation that basically collects information about what is happening in Europe in validation. We have developed together with the European Commission the European Guidelines on Validation of Non-Formal and Informal Learning. We just published the 3rd edition in May. And basically, well, I have been working on this area for now a little bit more than 10 years, I would say. And I'm very happy to kind of have a discussion about the topic and see if we can push even further the policies on validation.
I would like to ask you specifically, can you talk about, because not everyone who's listening to this podcast necessarily knows about validation of non-formal and informal learning. So can I ask you, Ernesto, to describe what the policy for that is?
Well, the problem with validation, I think we all know, is that it has a lot of names in a way, and in each country it has a little bit of different connotations in terms of, you talk about validation of non-formal and informal learning, other people talk about recognition of prior learning, accreditation of prior learning, sometimes assessment of prior learning. So there are many different terms that refer to, but I think it's at the end the same thing. What we always say is that validation is really a process, and it's about making visible what is invisible and giving it value to this learning that has been acquired in different ways. So it's really about giving value and making visible learning that is not necessarily visible because it hasn't been certified or it hasn't been clearly defined.
I think it might be useful to give like a broad outline of the European policies, tools, and guidelines that support validation. Because while we've talked about a lot of variety across member states, we haven't really talked about the structure that they work within and how that still allows countries with different systems to coordinate with each other.
Yeah, at the European level, I mean, we just published the European guidelines for validation of non-formal and informal learning. They are actually being now translated, and they should be after the summer ready, translated into Italian, Spanish, German, French. So they are in English already there. This is the 3rd edition, and the guidelines have been developed with all the member states in consultation with the member states, and we have used the expertise of many experts that have helped us to develop them. So they are really a tool. I always think that is really a tool to kind of guide if you want to see what are the main topics that are relevant when you are developing and creating systems of validation. Or the guidelines, the principles of the guidelines, let's say, they have been following the 2012 recommendation on validation. So in 2012, the European Union, the Council agree on a recommendation. So this means that all the member states agree on certain principles that are supposed to guide, let's say, the field of validation. I think that was very useful and really make, I always say, it's a cornerstone on the building of European policies on validation, because it really gives what are the main elements on validation, and this was followed up with an edition of the guidelines. So the guidelines kind of cover that, and the inventory that Manuel and I have been working on, it really tries to kind of bring in what is that actually happening in each country. At the European level, then validation now has been kind of framed within the skills strategy, the skills agenda, European skills agenda that has many different activities, and somehow validation is cutting across many of them. So there's no one specific flagship, and they call it on validation, but validation is embedded in micro-credentials issues, is embedded in the individual learning accounts, but I think it also relates very much to the Pact of Skills and to some other initiatives for sure on VET, for example, and different policies.
So we've been talking about all these great things about validation, but it all depends on having a practitioner who really knows how to bring out that information, how to work with clients, how to ask the right questions, what might count as a specific competence that's relevant for an employer, for example, or to an area of study. So can you talk a little bit about the guidance and validation practitioners and how that role is evolving in different?
Yeah, so it's not an easy task to be a guidance practitioner. And first of all, you have different languages, if you like, in the education system and in the labor market, but also within the labor market, even within the same company, right? So there's now some talk about the move towards skills-based organizations, and I'll talk a little bit about that before going back to the practitioners, just to give an illustration of these difficulties. And one of the main tasks that companies face when moving towards being a skills-based organization is to get their own skills typology, if you like, and to integrate their human resources systems so that they talk in the same language about skills, because they may have some software providers for parts of their recruitment, and then for part of their learning, and then for their compensation. And those may not match perfectly the way in which they talk about skills, the kind of skills that they cover, etc. So they need to do a job in making that more uniform and getting one vocabulary and one typology about skills within the company. So it's not easy for someone who's sitting outside that to take the labor market and to think, okay, what are the skills that are important and where can you develop those, and so on and so forth. And then you need to have the knowledge about validation and what it is and what types of validation initiatives may be appropriate to your clients, etc. And in the inventory, we've actually seen that this is one of the pressure points for validation initiatives, providing that support to those professionals working on validation in terms of guidance, in terms of assessment, etc. What sort of professional qualifications should they have? What sort of professional development should they be required to do and entitled to do, etc. So yeah, those are important aspects that these initiatives are working through.
And so what about tools to capture transversal skills? I mean, this is interesting because you've talked about, communication, for example, which we can say is a transversal skill, but the communication competences for journalism versus working on a team of engineers is going to be very different. So are there tools that can be applied for very different situations?
I think in the last few years, we have seen a big jump in terms of use of ICT for this kind of things. So there's a lot of new evaluation tools. So there's a lot of for validation where they kind of identify skills. If you want that first phase of validation, that is kind of computer assisted, if you want, they are becoming more and more sophisticated, more and more assessment based in a way, moving more towards actually a computer-based assessment kind of tool with RIT type of models where you can actually do psychometrics with some of the things and get a proper assessment. But I think that the practitioner will still be relevant and important. And the kind of assessment that is usually being done is of that kind of identification in a way. It's like it's a first step towards something else. ESCO is a good example of how complicated this is and how complex it is and how difficult it is to maintain something like this. Because I think that ESCO has been, I think, very useful in creating that place for discussion on what is needed and what is not. But at the end of the day, my feeling is that it becomes just one taxonomy, and what you need is the different stakeholders that are going to use those taxonomies that agree on what that actually means. And I think that ESCO has some of that in the governance of it. But I think that this is something that we need to kind of develop more. Like, we have to agree. Well, I think assessment actually is one of the key issues on the field that needs to be researched very much indeed. And I think that will be one of the main aspects. How do we adapt that assessment to these new realities that we were discussing in a way? That's really one of the main elements. The other thing that I think is crucial in terms of research is this idea of the coordination between the different services, the connection between the different types of contexts and settings. I think that will be the two main areas that I would say are fundamental on research. But I don't know. There are many other things that I'm going to. Okay,
but those were the big overarching.
Sorry, but I would say those two. Yeah.
Being systematic and transparent are themes that came through quite a lot. Yeah. Manuel, what would your research list include?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ernesto on those two, and within them you can find a range of elements. So, for example, we talked about migrants and refugees before, and this idea about culturally sensitive assessment, for example, would be one of those elements within the assessment area that I think would be important for those groups. In relation, in addition to what Ernesto has mentioned, I think that perhaps we could also continue to reflect on incentives for validation from the part of educational institutions and youth organizations and so on, and also individuals, because in spite of the benefits that we mentioned before can be derived from validation, the take-up is in some places somewhat slower and lower than what you would expect, given the importance of the topic. So what are the system of incentives that would help institutions, individuals, etc., embrace validation to a greater extent, and perhaps linked to this would be the outcomes of validation, and in terms of the quantification of benefits. And when I say quantification, I mean it in a broad way, and also encompassing those elements of personal development and advancement, well-being and satisfaction that we mentioned in the beginning as well. So how is it that validation is helping individuals, is helping organizations, is helping countries to achieve those goals in a more efficient and hopefully more equitable and fair way?
I'll give you a big thank you for sharing all your insights, and we will hopefully be able to see some further movement in this and perhaps check in later. Thanks.
in our Austrian training from EIESP, we invited practitioners from very different validation procedures or guidance projects in Austria from different regions. And so part of them were coming from validation procedures or guiding procedures which have the focus on the individual's development, personnel, or for employment, and for decisions concerning education and job questions. This was a large group of about 10 of the practitioners working with adults in general, or with migrants, or with people having impairs and rehabilitation processes and so on. And on the other side, we had a few of the practitioners working in validation processes where the certification really is in the focus of the procedure. So different approaches, let's say, in this field of validation. And as we have a very heterogeneous landscape of validation offers in Austria, and also the terminology is not that clear also in Austria, as Inga said, in Lithuania. We also started with the intro, with an input from an Austrian university professor about what validation really means and what's the benefits, what's the potentials of validation concerning making learning outcomes to be seen and to be recognized. So this was our intro, to have really a common understanding of what we are speaking, also about what are transversal skills, what is it, what does this mean. And this gave us a good basic and a good the exchange also was very important between these practitioners. And this gave us a good basic for the second day. We had a 3 days in presence training in Vienna, and the second day then was in focus was the workshops for methodological, so to really practice how to make this guidance and validation procedures running and going for transversal skills then.
So you all worked from the same framework, but then adapted it for your own locations and your own specific types of guidance counselors. Can I ask about Poland, Barbara?
Yes, I just wanted to say that Poland is exactly somewhere between Lithuania and Austria, because we were working with guidance counselors that work at schools, at secondary schools. It was not needed to teach them about the validation and competences, but we did just a very general introduction, just to be sure that we're on the same page when we are talking about competences and validation. But it appeared that, for example, still it is very important and very hard to understand the difference between identifying competences and verifying competences. So there is a lot of misunderstanding between those two stages. And in Poland, we were focused on 2 stages of validation of transversal competences, mainly on identification and then on documenting using a specialized application. So we proposed 2 tools to our practitioners to use during the field trials. It was the skills audit method. It was quite new for them. We gave them a lot of time during the training to train the art of interviewing a person, a client, especially when we have in mind the transversal competences. And I think that it was quite a successful part of the training because they were very interested in the method, and as far as we know, they are still using this method. And to the candidates, our guidance counselors were working at schools. We have proposed the application My Portfolio. It is an e-portfolio, and I would say that they really enjoyed using the new app for them.
Was it intuitive, both in the training and also in the implementation? Was the idea of what transversal competences are something easy to grasp?
Overall, I must say that in our case, among professionals, there was a good understanding and level of awareness and knowledge about what we mean for transversal competencies. But a point that was discussed and was kind of taken into consideration was the awareness of beneficiaries when it comes to this topic.
Inga, I wanted to ask you, since these were all very new concepts in Lithuania, did you have to spend more time really on defining concepts and getting people familiar with those?
I think the problem is with terminology. If something is new coming, we are calling the Lithuanian language everything like soft skills. So for them, it was not like difference between or general skills. So we had national problems with terminology in general, and transversal skills, even translation of that, it's called very strange in Lithuania. So this was explaining them what is different between soft skills and transversal skills. So I think in the end it was very funny that one of the participants was saying like how they were explaining to the candidates, to the students, what it is. She was saying that it is invisible bag where you are having everything and you're going from one place to another, but you have that bag with you. So this is your transversal competency. So I really liked that explanation.
Julia, you've been waiting patiently, so I'm going to ask you a question now. I think, maybe if you could talk about the design of the evaluation and focus primarily on the training at this point and some of the challenges perhaps of working with several different field trial countries where they've adjusted the training to fit their own contexts.
So we were really interested in accompanying this project. And so, basically what concerns the training, we didn't really evaluate the training as such. It was just the starting point for us to see where field trials were going. And it was the point when we realized that there will be significant differences among the countries. And when we started to balance, the way my colleague Maurice put it, to find a balance between practice and science. Because, of course, for the research point of view, it would have been ideal to have the same modules and then the same focus on competences in all the field trials. But we soon realized that this would be very challenging and would not really fit the needs of all the field trial partners. We got a lot of results, more than we had actually expected in the beginning. So that also made up a little bit for these differences in the various countries, because overall we got more than 200 answered questionnaires. Mm-hmm. And we could actually see that the whole validation process had a big impact, a big positive impact on the candidates. And irrespective of the type of field trial that they were part of. So that's basically a very good, I think it's a very good result that just shows that validation, no matter in which form, always basically, that's really a conclusion, always has a positive impact on most of the candidates. Of course, not on all of them, but really a very strong impact was visible from analyzing the results. And it was really irrespective of the type of validation, and even because, like we just heard, in each country, different stages of the validation process were focused on. And irrespective of that, whether it was only identifying and documenting the transversal competences or whether it went all the way towards really certifying them, there was always a positive impact throughout. Possibly because this was also something we gained from the interviews we did with practitioners, that it just, the whole setting is something very empowering. So
This is interesting because not only are people identifying their transversal competences, by the fact of identifying them, they're also strengthening them. That's what you're saying. And I see people nodding that this seems to resonate with them.
Studied the practitioners that took part in the project. In each country, we tried to get a certain number of practitioners to join and to fill in questionnaires before participating in the field trial and after finishing their participation. Almost unexpectedly, that because when we looked at the practitioners that took part in the field trials, most of them were very experienced. They had years of experience and they considered themselves very professional. And even though they were all basically at a very high level to start with, they still, well, at least 75% really answered in a way that shows that they increased their, well, their level of competence regarding transversal competences on the one hand, but also on in relation to the validation process and to validating transversal competences in particular. And also they increased their competency towards regarding assessment, how to assess competences in relation especially to transversal competences.
Julia, I think I read in the evaluation that some of the feedback from practitioners was that the concepts were very abstract and that they really had to work to bring these down to their daily life and to translate that in a way.
Yes, indeed. That was one of the feedback we received in quite a few interviews, that yeah, there is a bit of a difference between like the theory and the wording of how, for example, the framework is set up, and then in the actual work with candidates, a lot of practitioners mentioned that they basically had to do some translation work to translate it into a more well, into words that are closer to the reality of the candidates, let's say, and not at this abstract education bubble that we are in a way.
Yeah.
But well, they did enjoy the work nevertheless, and they said once they translated it, it became very accessible for their candidates. Well, communicate. Communicate with everyone from the start, clarify terminology, clarify timelines, and yeah, kind of have a plan about the whole project in the beginning. Yeah, not to overlook certain aspects that become unclear as you start really getting into the topic. I mean, it will always happen anyway, but as far as possible, it helps to think everything through with the relevant partners in charge, really.
Well, I have one lesson learned regarding the trainings, because we made 2 different trainings in Salzburg. One with a very heterogeneous group of practitioners, and the other one with a homogeneous group working with the same target group. And both trainings were really successful. But you always have to think about, what do you want with the training? Do you want to focus on the exchange of the practitioners, exchanging their different experiences, and so focusing on the peer-to-peer learning? Or do you want to create some kind of common method, a common tool on how to work with your candidates? Then it is better to work in a homogeneous group. So just focus on your aim, on your objective, on the training can help to make the training even more successful.
Great. That sounds actually kind of like it echoes a bit of the general advice on having a plan, but also being adaptable or flexible. So we can think of those as main lessons learned.
If I can,
Yeah.
I would recommend to involve practitioners from the beginning in the design of the field trial. I think it would then facilitate and make the whole process easier. I would also say don't be scared. There will be points in which you think that you will not manage, but in fact then it is possible. And also about timing within projects, it is always an issue. But I think that processes as the field trials that we have implemented that really wanted to make a difference, to be grounded in the context, etc., deserve time to be effective. So maybe just give you a couple of more months than you expect to need, yeah.
I'm sure evaluators always appreciate time as well, because it's an important element in really seeing what the true impact of any given intervention is. So have I forgotten anything that's really important, or any, vital last words?
So add what was Chiara was saying. So I think it's very important to think about the benefits for the candidate, no, for the participant in general. So this means that if we are just assuming that we will have a public call and I don't know, 200 people will be knocking to our doors, it's not going to happen. I don't know, in other countries, in Lithuania for sure. When you have a benefit and explaining them what they benefit from the participation, from the project, from the time, so it's much easier than to involve people and to communicate with them. So I think it is a very important thing. I don't think that it should be money. We didn't pay money to anyone, but it was like accredited program, peer learning, invitation of the experts, some new knowledge. When you are explaining them where you can use your learning outcomes in the national system. So this is like to talk with them what they will benefit from that.
So selling the benefits of the program, very important.